What is it that determines the sort of people that we'll turn out to be? Is it your genes? What you inherit from your family? Or is it the sort of place that you grow up in and the experiences that you have as you're doing that growing up thing? Of course, that's a pressing question in the mind of many a parent or person with questions that relate to their own identity, I guess. And of course, that issue also kicks up a huge number of questions for migrants and displaced people. What ends up making a person the person they turn out to be? There's a long historic discussion of whether it's nature or nurture. And the interesting thing to me is that if you went through the Bible, through the history of God's dealings with mankind, and you picked out the men who God has used as the outstanding pillars in the process of sorting out the mess humanity got into and bringing about redemption, you'd possibly pick out people like Noah and Abraham, Moses, David, and then a small set of others in the New Testament period around Peter, James, John, and Paul. And one of the things that encourages me most about that is that for quite a significant number of those people, either they didn't have a very good start in life, or for them, life just really wasn't a cakewalk. Moses is definitely right up there with the most startling of these cases, yet Moses was God's chosen instrument to lead God's people out of Egyptian bondage, through the testing in the wilderness, right up to the promised land, with a distinct meta-narrative, a distinct understanding of the world, to give them an understanding of their place in God's world. And with a God-given covenant to order their lives, a covenant that would give them secure identity as the redeemed people of God. Now, Moses' life was a life of huge life transitions, involving significant changes of status, circumstances, responsibilities and environment. And in many ways, it was a proper old bramble bush tangle. But bubbling beneath it was an astonishing, life-giving stream of God's purpose for that man that was worked out through all those changeable times and that tangle of a mess of his early life that it often seemed to be. Today we're going to marvel in Exodus 2 at what God could do to bring a person through the dramatic shifts from being an abandoned baby in a basket under an oppressive government seeking to kill him, through being a prince in Egypt and a fugitive and humble shepherd in Midian, preparing him at every step of the way for the huge role that God had for him, leading God's people, totally against all the perceived odds, from bondage to liberty, as the people of God. So Exodus 2 explores the winds of change blowing through the earlier part of Moses' life as he gets prepared by God for his significant later service. Sometimes those winds do begin to blow. And this chapter, Exodus 2, is structured around these three key events, each highlighting a stage in Moses' early life under God's providential care, undergoing God's preparation for what lay beyond those changing times. So first of all, the chapter begins with Moses' birth and preservation at a very early age. Pharaoh had issued a decree to kill Hebrew male infants, and Moses needs to be hidden by his mother and then placed in a basket on the River Nile. And that event showcases themes of divine protection, foreshadows Moses' future deliverance of Israel. And then there's the discovery and adoption of Moses by Pharaoh's daughter. That introduces the irony that Moses is raised in the very place that sought his people's destruction, the palace of Pharaoh. Then the second section describes Moses' emerging sense of identity and justice, a strong sense of justice in verses 11 to 15. Moses goes out to see what's happening with his Hebrew people out from the palace, and he intervenes in the oppression of a Hebrew, killing an Egyptian who was beating that guy. And that act, driven by Moses' growing awareness of his Hebrew identity, it also does a bit to reveal his impulsive nature. And then his subsequent flight to Midian after Pharaoh seeks his life marks a transition from prince to fugitive. And then the final section of this chapter involves Moses' settlement in Midian, verses 16 to 22, where he assists Jethro's daughters, marries Zipporah, and becomes a shepherd. A period characterized by transformation through humility and preparation, setting the stage for his future leadership. Significantly, the chapter ends with Moses naming his son Gershom, meaning foreigner, reflecting his sense of alienation and displacement. Still feels like he's back in the weeds. So that's where we're going in Exodus 2. But let's start at the beginning. Firstly then, Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. The lovely story of Moses in the bulrushes. It's both romantic and legendary, but the realities of the situation were actually pretty stark. First of all, verses 1 to 3, Moses was born into oppression. He was born into a situation of terrible oppression. Exodus 1 opened the window on that for us. In verse 8 it says, a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them or they'll become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar, with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. It would get worse before it got better, but the situation Moses was born into was one where, Exodus 1:22, Pharaoh had issued a decree that all newborn Hebrew boys should now be killed, in order, he thought, to weaken these dangerous Israelites and prevent their potential rebellion against him. And in that oppressive situation, Exodus 2, 1-2, we read this. A man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Jochebed, Moses' mother, was a Levite. She had a baby under these terrible circumstances, and she seems to have hid the baby for the first 3 months of his life. No mean feat. But then, for some reason, whether the difficulty of concealing him became too great or whether it was for some other reason we just don't know, she took some pretty drastic action. Now, the Bible's got several stories about miraculous or special births and deliverances of those destined to lead Israel, and their impact is essentially to authenticate that individual's ministry. If the person's start in life was providentially provided, protected by the Lord, then the mission must be of divine origin too. So in this chapter here, the plot works around the decree for the death of the children, a decree miraculously undone and brought to a happy conclusion. But the plot would be as nothing without this desperate woman, Jochebed's, not an easy name to say, trust in God and his plans when, having done all she could do in a difficult situation, she then placed this child, Moses, in the river, trusting to the God who can bring about miraculous outcomes from the direst situations. Now, why do I think this was an act of faith, not despair? Because she did it having seen this was a fine child. And that prompted her to try and save him, not to destroy him humanely. And because she not only chooses to put the child where the princess bathed, but the child's oldest sister comes to quietly watch to see what would happen. Now, you wouldn't do that, send that child, if you expected a long, lingering, miserable death for the child, not a violent and ghastly one at the mercy of a crocodile, for example. You wouldn't do that if you didn't see that this fine child must surely have a future and entrust him to God for that future. Incidentally, that word for a fine child, it's the Hebrew word tov, pleasant, which is the word used repeatedly in Genesis when God looked at what he'd just created and declared that it was good. Also, the word used for a basket, is a word used only once elsewhere. The word is tevar, ark, and the only other place it's used is to describe the boat that Noah built to bring God's people out of the destruction their sin had brought on the people. Well, there you go. This woman has this child, and she's driven to this awful thing to have to do. And secondly, verses 4 to 10, that child is raised in a palace. Who would have guessed that? See, the faith and hope being expressed in this desperate situation, they get two human reactions that transform the baby boy's situation completely. Firstly, Pharaoh's daughter discovers Moses. Here's the narrative of how things got set up. Verses 5 and 6. Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. And she opened it and saw the baby, and he was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Now, that is just the narrative setting up the plot. But not a lot of that is very normal. Pharaoh's daughter is the daughter of the guy trying to destroy the Israelites by destroying their babies. And babies were being killed all round by her father's command. And there's nothing to indicate that he was a person with a very democratic disposition. Neither was he much of a feminist. So Pharaoh's daughter, by even sending her female slave down into the river to investigate the baby crying in a floating basket, was playing a risky game. It was obvious what was going on with the basket, but then seeing the baby and subverting her father's royal polity, preventing what he feared would be the overthrow of the state, doing so by rescuing that baby and taking him home, that was not normal. But there was more. Because second thing that happens here, Miriam, her quick thinking and courage reunite Jochebed with the baby. Verses 7 to 9. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." Jochebed gets to raise her son, and to do it, all expenses paid. Moses could now be raised in the faith of his ancestors, taught his origins and identity until he was older, and then pursue a very attractive livelihood, living as the son of Pharaoh's daughter in the palace, an Egyptian prince. Being schooled in all the learning of the Egyptians, but with a clear idea about God and God's dealings with his people. And it looks as if that's it. God has provided the wisdom of trusting in God even in desperate circumstances. Moses is set up for life, and everyone's happy ever after. Except they're not. And God has much bigger things to do in Moses' life to fit him for the greater service of God and of God's people. Secondly, in this chapter, in verses 11 to 15, just goes into the whole issue of identity and a sense of injustice that's plaguing Moses' thought. See, there he is, the son of a persecuted minority, being raised by his Hebrew mother in their faith and culture, then brought into the household of the persecuting power, dedicated to the extermination of his people. Moses was bound to have a bit of a teenage identity crisis, wouldn't you think? There are a few definitions for identity crisis, but the concept typically refers to questioning your place in the world. Where do I fit in all this? And then, of course, who you are as a person. In psychology, a crisis typically refers to intense mental distress caused by the perception that a change is imminent. and that you don't have the resources to handle the change. And though a crisis often has a negative connotation, of course it does, it can be an opportunity for growth and positive change. And in the longer term, things are going to head that way for Moses. But at the moment, it just looks like a crisis. An identity crisis is when you persistently question who you are, including your life purpose, your core beliefs, your personality, your experiences, and thoughts that create your perception of yourself. And we can see all that here on that day, at that moment with Moses. Moses is facing a typical make it or break it moment when you're faced with an important predicament regarding your personal growth and sense of self. How's this going to go? Well, first of all, verses 11 to, well, just verse 11 really, Moses goes out to observe the suffering of his Hebrew people. It says in verse 11, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labour. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. What's going on here? Well, obviously, Moses is concerned for his people, and that's why he goes out. Their issue was not immediately his issue, because he lives this life of privilege as the adopted grandchild of Pharaoh. But he makes it his business, and he's about to make it very much his issue as well. Commitment to his people, God's people, is growing in him already. And there he gets to see the full-on reality of it as he goes out. Immediately, this unjust scene of violence before his very eyes poses the question for Moses as to just where it is that he stands and just who it is that he is. Whose people are his people, after all? Well, for God's future messenger of the law of God and the one who will be primarily responsible for administering justice to the people as they come out of Egypt and trek 40 years through the wilderness, Moses learns something here about how important justice is to him. Here in verse 12 comes an important moment of self-discovery for Moses, as he actively involves himself in seeing that justice, in inverted commas, is administered. Verse 12, looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian. That's the slave master who was beating the Hebrew person. Killed him and hid him in the sand. And Moses had been concerned enough for his people, his Hebrew people, to go out in the previous verse to see how they were getting on. But he's seen how they were getting on. He's now seen the situation firsthand and close up. And yet he radically identifies himself with his Hebrew people's welfare and protection. He puts his own life on the line, not just with the Egyptian slave driver, who after all has a weapon in his hand, which Moses presumably lacks, but also at risk from Pharaoh for defending the cause of the Hebrews, who Pharaoh has decided are a threat to his state. Moses was concerned for his people before, but now he has decisively crossed the Rubicon and there is no going back. And tomorrow when he wakes up, the implications of his act are going to finally dawn on him. But today, this lad who had a rough start in life, then climbed to the elite levels of the Egyptian state and society, has committed murder. And he's now about to become an enemy of the state. Yes, he's now clear. He's passionately committed to justice and to the well-being of his Hebrew people. It's about to have far-reaching consequences for his life. Moses is no longer just another Egyptian prince, but has self-identified himself as a passionate seeker of justice and a fiery defender of his Hebrew people, God's people. And everything now seems set to go horribly wrong. And yet, even in this chaotic phase of life, God proves trustworthy and provides for Moses' good. So the news breaks, and Moses flees in verses 13 to 15. Next day he went out, saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" And the man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" And then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. What exactly is this passage about? Now, of course, what happens is that Moses discovers he's been rumbled. His violent act, killing the slave driver out of his outraged sense of justice, has been witnessed. But the point is that the Hebrews who are fighting absolutely reject the idea that Moses should be what? Something unusual, something very specific. Let's hear it. Who made you ruler and judge over us? Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian? What they're specifically rejecting in Moses at this point in his life and career with God is the very thing that God would make him at a later time, ruler and judge over the Hebrew people. And that role, that authority, if you like, which he had later, is something he emphatically does not have either by nature or at this point, in reality, by upbringing in his life. See, in some ways, the seeds of Moses' identity are being revealed. He is born to be the judge and human ruler of God's people, the Hebrews, however much or little he understands about that. This is being revealed to us in this passage as the inclination, the reflex action, the yearning of his heart, and God has given that desire or inclination or whatever it is to him. But he needs work yet. God needs to work on him, to train him, to form him, and then also robe him with that very authority to do exactly that which the Hebrews who are fighting reject. At a later stage, to do the things that the Lord has planned for him to do. And then, as if to threaten him and intimidate him from pursuing his attempt to be the intermediary and correct their conduct at this point, the fighting Hebrew slave challenges Moses and asks, "Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" And the man who would not later run from any challenge to his God-given authority to specifically judge and rule Israel, now at this point, lacking that authenticated, supported call from God and acknowledged by an authority he possessed, well, he didn't possess it. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Next phase for Moses, please. Next phase is in verses 16 to 20. Life's new start for Moses. At the end of his run, Moses arrives in Midian and sits down at a well. He's exhausted, he's alone, he's in a foreign land, and he sits at what was usually a slightly cooler place of refreshment. And here comes a clear indication that at our lowest and most fearful point, God has got everything very much in hand. Now, of course, he comes to a well and he sits down, and readers of the Old Testament hear where he sat down at a well, and they're just waiting for something good to happen, because wells in the Old Testament are places where God often locates pivotal moments. God met Hagar and reassured her about her son Ishmael at a well. Rebekah was found for Isaac as a wife at a well. Jacob met Rachel at a well. We're still just in the book of Genesis here. So look what happens here as Moses sits down at that well in Midian, verses 16 to 17. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away. But Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. Moses defends the daughters of Jethro, is also called Reuel, defends them from bullying shepherds. That old desire to prevent and protect in Moses pops up again. Actually, Moses is beginning to look like a fairly handy bloke, isn't he? Sorting out a slave driver, fighting off a bunch of bullying shepherds. But that's not really the point. The point is that we see again here in Moses a really deep sense of justice and injustice, and a natural inclination to stand up for those who are being unjustly treated, to stand up for the oppressed. And there again is the seed in his character that foreshadows the future role that God was preparing him for as the protector and as the leader of the Hebrews. Notice the concept here. that God leads those who value what he values to new beginnings in unexpected places through acts of service, even when life has taken an unexpected and unwelcome turn, like having to run away from Pharaoh. See, with God, there are no unexpected turns, only preparation for the plans that he has for his faithful people. Well, now in verses 18 and 19, Jethro's daughters give him the account of what Moses had done, and they get sent straight back by their father to bring Moses home for tea. And wedding bells start to chime. Here it comes. Secondly, then, the preparation for life's purpose in Midian, verses 21 and 22. Moses, we're cutting a long story short, gains a wife of humble standing and is precipitated from the palace of Egypt into the sheepfolds of Midian and a career as a shepherd in rather arid lands. There's been a drastic change in his situation in life, from prince in Egypt to shepherd in the dry lands. And there's been a drastic change in his role. Married to Zipporah and learning to shepherd sheep. And as ever, in Moses' case, sheep were actually just a means to an end. It's astonishing how the Lord used tending flocks of people in the Old Testament to form their character and to form the capabilities of men he intended to shepherd his flock. You get Jacob, classic case, serves as a shepherd for his uncle Laban, tending Laban's flocks for many years, Genesis 30, 29 to 31, and we've still got a breed of sheep named after Jacob. And that role played a significant part in Jacob's life, leading to the increase of his wealth, of course, and the fulfillment of God's promises to him. Then you got David. David was a shepherd boy before he was anointed king of Israel, and he cared for his father's sheep and famously protected them from predators like lions and bears. David's experience as a shepherd, and we read about it in 1 Samuel 16:11 and 17:34 to 36, his experience as a shepherd was a formative part of his preparation to become a king, with shepherding often used as a metaphor for kingship in the Bible. And then there's Moses. Now there's Moses. Before leading the Israelites out of Egypt, he spends 40 years in Midian as a shepherd, tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, and his time as a shepherd is preparing him for his role as the leader of Israel, teaching him patience, which he lacked. Remember that slave driver back in Egypt? Humility, which he needed after being raised as a privileged Egyptian prince. And how to care for the flock, qualities essential for leading God's people at that particular point in human history. So this time of waiting then that opens up before Moses, while he seems to be on hold, seems to be apparently doing very little in the big scheme of things, this time of waiting was critical for his personal and spiritual growth, a time of radical transformation, a time of deep character development and preparation for forthcoming tasks. Building skills, building character that would later be crucial in managing the leadership of the Hebrews. And all the time it must have looked like the outcome of a disastrous circumstance, and as if he was doing very little of consequence, just shepherding sheep. What do we take away from this? How do we draw a conclusion about what this story is all about? See, when things looked desperate for the Hebrews, God had a plan and he was bringing it about. When a mother in desperation for the plight of her fine child, we were told that, abandoned the baby in the bulrushes, God was working out the course of his plan. When Moses lost his rag with the unjust brutality of the slave driver, God still had the means to overcome the youthful impetuousness that struck the man dead, and he had the ability to hone the powerful motivation to do justice and rescue the oppressed that lay deep in Moses and would be needed for what was to come later. Again, when Moses had to flee on his toes with nothing from Egypt to Midian, God had a good woman and a nurturing of the man planned there for Moses. In the midst of relative poverty and insignificance, in a foreign land, as a foreigner there, hear the pain in his words. All that time of disappointment and reversal and loss. God not only had a plan for Moses, but was forging the inner man of Moses to make him the man who could challenge Pharaoh, who could lead out the Israelites through the sea and deal not only with delivering them into a situation where they had God's law, but also leading a desperately wayward and disappointing people in very large numbers through a bare, unforgiving desert for 40 years. God had a plan. And he was managing history and forging character to bring that plan to pass. So when it is our lives that are going through that sort of situation, let's say they aren't quite turning out as we had planned either. This God who was Moses' God is our God. And you can see in what he did with Moses that in all the changing scenes and circumstances of our life, the God who led Moses is a God who is to be trusted to fulfill his plan and his purpose for me when I trust him. God bless you. Have a great week.